Those of us as lawyers are seeing how, in a larger sense, the rule of law is being challenged in ways that many of us never imagined. And the Chicago Council provides an opportunity for people to do something about that.
Its work may not be known to the masses, but many have new rights, new opportunities, and new access because of the work Chicago Appleseed has done.
The Council and Chicago Appleseed are dedicated to rooting out invisible injustices throughout our court system and our justice system more generally.
They provide real evidence-based policy advocacy positions based on real data and research.
It really focuses on the small barriers and obstacles to justice that litigants are facing every day.
There are so many ways in which it is difficult to navigate the justice system, and the Council and Appleseed help serve to bridge that gap.
They shine a light on that Byzantine world of courts that I think is really tough to understand.
Chicago Appleseed has earned the respect of all the stakeholders in the courts. Judges, clerks, and defense attorneys know the impact of our systemic reform work and work with us
to create a real, practical solution to solve a problem that affects the most marginalized groups in our community.
Even just one successful systemic reform initiative can have a sweeping impact.
I find that the Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice is small, but it is mighty.
As a summer intern, I saw how hard the staff attorneys worked every day to fix some of these barriers to justice that members of our community are facing, and they do so with so little resources that in order to affect real change that they're looking for, they need your help.
The collaboration is faced with a lot of uncertainty in these times, but its work is more vital now than ever.
I think the work of Chicago Appleseed and the collaboration for justice is vital for all Chicagoans if we're going to have a true reform of our justice system.
I hope you'll join me in supporting this very important organization
to advocate for systemic change within our court system, to make that system fairer, more accessible, and more effective for the public that it serves.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Chicago Appleseed's virtual forum on reshaping criminal justice in Cook County and Illinois. My name is Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve, and I'm an associate professor at Brown University and an affiliated faculty with the American Bar Foundation, Bar Association in Chicago. I authored 2 books on Chicago's criminal justice system, Cook County and The Waiting Room. And today I'm excited to host this all-star panel as we envision how we can improve justice in our city and in our state. This panel represents some of the best ambassadors of reform in our area who've worked, advocated, and pushed for systemic change in policing, courts, and corrections. So let me make some brief introductions. First, we have Ali Abid, and he is the program coordinator for Cook County Justice Advisory Council, helping advance Cook County Board President's juvenile and criminal justice reform programming. Before joining the JAC, Ali was the senior criminal justice policy analyst for Chicago Appleseed and a George N. Leighton Fellow for the study of prisoners' rights. He's taught and published on topics related to mass incarceration and race, prisoners' rights, and restorative justice, and is an alumni of John Marshall Law School. We also have Amy Campanelli, who was sworn in as the public defender of Cook County in 2015 after working in criminal defense for over 27 years. After the death penalty was abolished in Illinois, Amy served as the deputy chief of homicide task force of the Felony Trial Division. In 2012, she became the deputy public defender in charge of all 5 suburban Cook County districts until her appointment as public defender. Amy's primary initiatives as public defender include bond court reform, strengthening problem-solving courts, community outreach, and professional development. As public defender, she's also worked with the chief judge of Cook County to secure the rights of public defenders to represent detained people at police stations. Our next panelist is Jobi Kate. She's the executive director and founder of Restore Justice, a statewide criminal justice reform organization focused on long-term incarceration and its impact for individuals, families, and communities. From 2008 through 2014, Jobi was the senior director of Chicago and Midwest Regional Office of Human Rights Watch, where she led efforts to end the practice of sentencing children who commit serious crimes to life without parole. Jobi was recently confirmed as a member of the Illinois Youth Budget Commission by the governor. Sharone Mitchell Jr. is the director of Illinois Justice Project. Before Sharone joined the Illinois Justice Project in 2016, he was a trial attorney with the Cook County Public Defender's Office. His work focuses on adult justice, specializing in pretrial issues, sentencing policy, violence prevention. He is a member of Chicago Appleseed's board of directors, sits on the associate board of the Chicago Debates, an organization facilitating high school policy debate in Chicagoland, and serves on the board of St. Leonard's Ministry, an organization that provides comprehensive residential case management and employment service to those released from prison. We also have John Pilsner. He's the co-chair of the Collaboration for Justice's Criminal Justice Advisory Committee, where he has worked extensively on efforts around reducing court costs, fines, and fees, as well as many other reforms. He joined the Office of the State Appellate Defender to represent people on appeal before the Illinois Appellate and Supreme Courts. His current caseload includes cases from all 5 Illinois districts, and he's won a wide range of cases, including expanding the rights of juveniles on probation and helping incarcerated people access the secret Chicago police street files. Before practicing law, he was a newspaper reporter covering criminal justice issues in Northern Colorado, where he was born and raised, before moving to Chicago permanently. We also have Randolph Stone, who was a clinical professor of law at the University of Chicago for 31 years, serving as the director of the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic and the University of Chicago Law School from 1991 to 2001. Randolph guided students through the intricacies of Cook County's criminal justice system, and he dedicated himself to bringing about policy reforms for a more equitable society, including by abolishing mandatory juvenile life sentences without parole. Before becoming a professor, Randolph Stone served as a public defender of Cook County. We have Alexa Van Brundt. She's a clinical associate professor of law and a director of the MacArthur Justice Center Clinic at Northwestern University. She served as the lead counsel on a class action lawsuit addressing discrimination and excessive force by police, the violation of prisoners' rights in correction facilities, and wrongful conviction damages and actions. The elimination of cash bond in the criminal courts as well. In 2017, she helped represent community groups, including Black Lives Matter Chicago and the NAACP, in its suit challenging the Chicago Police Department's pattern of practice of unconstitutional force. We'd like to welcome everybody today, and I wanted to start by giving every person on this panel a chance to kind of make an opening statement, to talk about what is most passionate of all the projects that they're working on and kind of getting us closer to reform. So I'm going to go on the order I see everybody on their screen. So why don't we start with Jonathan Pilsner?
Sorry, now that I'm unmuted, that's an incredibly broad question, because there's and everybody here I think will agree, there's so many reform efforts going right now. But I think that's kind of that kind of illustrates what I think is most important right now, that there is such momentum behind so many different things. Whereas in the past, you would have to move mountains to do something as simple as, for example, change fines and fees for criminal defendants that were being perpetually taxed by the state into poverty on a regular basis. In the past, that took years and years and years to get any momentum going for that. What's important now is the fact that there are so many people at the table. There are so many people in this room. There are so many people outside of this room that we are all connected to, that are all pushing comprehensive reform that honestly, maybe, even 3 years ago, most of us would have thought absolutely unobtainable. So the fact that we have so much momentum going right now, and that there are so many people pushing, and we are collaboratively working and pushing all of that together in this unified effort is astounding. I mean, the strides we've made just on possibly abolishing money bail and the conversation around that is incredible. And so what I have been passionate about is changing that conversation and advancing it. Mm-hmm. And from where I started when I first began this work, not that long ago, to where we are now, it feels like we're the momentum is building. And now how do we build on that and keep pushing it forward? And everybody in this conversation has a huge role to do with that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Jobi, we'll take it to you. Maybe a brief opening statement on what is most important to you right now that you're working on?
I'm not using my power to mute and unmute very effectively, it seems. I don't want to follow Jonathan because I feel like I'm going to be the Debbie Downer. But I do, Jonathan, I want you to take a recording of what you just said, and I want to put it on my morning alarm so that every morning when I get out of bed, that's the first thing I hear. I feel like at Restore Justice, we're still very much diverted by COVID-19 and the conditions in Illinois prisons. And we have, as of March 15th or so, we put our entire state legislative agenda on hold, as a lot of people did, to work on issues related to mitigating the spread of the virus, and in our case, for the most part in prisons, but in jails and in courts as well. The truth is, the reason we did that is because we aren't lawyers. Not that lawyers don't care too, but most of us at Restore Justice are either loved ones of people who are currently incarcerated, or people who were formerly incarcerated, and it's our friends and our family members who are in those cells. So while we have a number of really excellent lawyers on our board, and we have a staff, professional staff as well, we never stray too far from caring about the human beings who are suffering right now. And that has changed our trajectory. I think just to riff a little bit on what Jonathan said, I just feel happy seeing these faces. And I'm thinking about probably in 2008 or 2009, walking into a coalition meeting at Northwestern and meeting Randy Stone for the first time. And at that time, I never in a million years would have imagined that we would have started a state level lobbying organization. Basically, it was the first thing we started, a civic organization called Restore Justice Illinois. I never would have conceived of that. I didn't know that the state of Illinois locked up kids for life without parole. I didn't know that we didn't have parole. I didn't know that we had taken away time off for good behavior. I knew about as much about criminal justice as you can learn on TV. So Randy and the people in that room that day, including family members of people who were incarcerated, changed my life. They put me on a different course. And I hope that course is leading us to participate in that world Jonathan is talking about. I want to be part of that world. But we tend to work on the deep end of the pool issues, the hardest sentencing issues, and during normal times, we just do the best we can to have an impact on state policy.
And I think that's a really great point. I want to revisit that as we go there. When we say, are we serving the purpose of justice? It's one thing as a reformer, as a lawyer, as a stakeholder to feel that we are making progress. It's another thing to live through it and want justice like right now. So thank you for reminding us that. Ali, can you take us through what you feel is the most kind of important change and project that you're working on right now?
Certainly. I mean, sort of, in the same spirit of both Jonathan and Jobi, this is an incredibly high variance year in terms of what could possibly happen and what we need to happen, and also how little could wind up happening. Although we have moved the conversation forward, and when I say we, I'm talking about a very broad umbrella, largely built by people who are protesting in the streets and actually organizing, and those connected to those individuals who are involved in the justice system. But the conversation has moved very far. However, the venues to actually affect the change have constrained, largely because of COVID-19, reducing our calendars for where legislation can be done, reducing lines of communication and such, and reducing venues to work collaboratively on bills and such. So it's hard to tell what will come of this year. So if you were asking me 2 years ago, what we'd hope to accomplish, we have been working in coalition with a number of the people on the panel on large, comprehensive sentencing reform bills to reduce how drug sentencing is done, the categorization of certain offenses. And on a normal sort of 2-year legislative strategy, we would think, okay, well, this is an education year, and then we're going to try to get it past, and like, and this spring or that spring or this fall or that fall. But this year, all of that's still in the hopper. We're hoping to see movement on that. We're hoping to see a certain movement that, I'm sure the public defender will discuss in their rusty phone call bill that their office has championed, and various other things. But also, we're hoping that all the subject matter hearings, everything that's being done to really look at both policing and the nature of the courts and money bond will result in really large comprehensive change. Now, if that can happen, is still up for debate. And I think, well, like with so many things this year, I think, we shoot back and forth between a feeling of like incredible despair about like the needs that are present, and then also the opportunity and how clearly we're discussing what needs to be done. That, I would say the one, I would like to see, very like sort of put in very prosaic regular terms, large scale sentencing reform, an end to money bail, and that's what I would hope to happen. But I don't know, and something to the tune of a beefed up civilian bill of rights, which in terms of an interaction with law enforcement. Right. And for that to be assembled somewhere between the state and municipal levels and county levels, and for that to really move forward, and for our investments to match what we're hoping to reach. I'm hoping all of those things happen, and but yeah, we will see. I know everyone's working very hard to take advantage of this strange moment.
Absolutely. Randolph Stone, if you can give us your kind of opening statement, what do you feel? Maybe it's changed over the times that you've started this advocacy work. What are the most pressing things that you're seeing right now that you're working for, or see hope?
Well, I guess I would put it in three categories. The first is racism and the elimination of racism. That it affects almost everything in the criminal justice system, from misdemeanor arrests to excessive sentencing. So, and when I say the first is racism, I mean some sort of acknowledgement that this is a problem. I think for most of us who work in the area and are about advocacy, we recognize it, but I think the larger audience may not recognize or even acknowledge that racism affects almost every aspect of the system. And I think until we can get a base level of acknowledgement, it's very difficult to make the changes that need to be made. The second sort of area for me is this idea of collaboration that somebody else mentioned. Intersectionality, I guess, is another way of putting it, in terms of recognizing that criminal justice reform is just a small piece of the puzzle. Very important piece, but it's also connected to inequality and discrimination and racism and other aspects of society that we have to deal with. So I think it's real important to understand that criminal justice reform is connected. And we need to get our allies together who are working on other areas of reform and to kind of coalesce. And then the third point, I guess, for me is a sense of urgency about the situation that we're in. People have been marching in the streets and protesting and doing their thing. For those of us who are considered more on the inside, the professionals, so to speak, I think we need to adopt that same sense of urgency and be willing to stand up and to speak out when we see injustice and inequality. So those are my three areas.
Nice, thank you so much. And Sharone, if you can give us your opening statement and what you're working on that gives you hope in terms of transforming justice.
Thank you. My most interesting and exciting project is my work with the coalition in money bond and the Illinois Network for Pretrial justice, in which Appleseed and Illinois Justice Project is a member, and we have frequent collaborators on this call, like literally everybody. I was looking at the squares, literally every single organization. So whether it's Northwestern or the appellate folks, the finest law firm in the county, the Cook County Public Defender's Office, Restorative Justice, or the JAC, everybody's been working with us on that. And our goal is really, we're trying to end money bond and reformat the decision-making process for determining who goes into jail and who's not in the jail. Because we know that pretrial incarceration is it's just one issue, but one of the biggest issues. We really feel like there's a significant link between that and mass incarceration and wrongful convictions. I think there's a reason why we have about 3,000 shows on Netflix right now about wrongful incarcerations, because of how we drive people into jail and how driving people in jail drives them into prison. So I'm super excited about our work on reducing the amount of people who are in jail, and also stopping just the predatory tactics of county government, which is pulling all of these dollars out of people's pockets. So we've done a really good job in Cook County with the leadership of our board president, Tony Preckwinkle, to reduce the use of money bond. We've reduced it significantly, but we need to eradicate it, and we need to bring that to the other 101 counties in the state of Illinois. So I'm super excited. We got some all-stars, and really, even if it's not that, at this point, just pick any of these issues, right? There's so many issues that are being represented that these folks will talk about on this call. If we just pick one of these super substantive, super structural changes, nobody's asking for something small anymore. Everybody's working for something big. So whether it's bond reform, whether it's reformatting how people are treated in the prison system, whether it's talking about folks' access to calls, whatever it is, let's get to work on it, because quite frankly, we've had people in the streets fighting for change. And here's the secret. We haven't seen a lot of results. We haven't seen a lot of impact, right? A lot of things haven't happened, right? You look at all the people that are in the streets and you look at the results, and quite frankly, people are working hard, but they haven't gotten what they needed. So pick it all. Any money buy would be great. Reforming the criminal justice system would be great. The pretrial justice system would be great, but just pick anything.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
And make it better. Thank you so much. Amy, we'll turn to you if you can give an opening statement on things you're working on that give you hope for change.
Okay, so I became the public defender, as you said, Nicole, in 2015. And I think the Tribune did a piece on me 6 months in and said, public defender comes out swinging. And I called the system, I don't call it a criminal justice system, right? I never have. I call it a criminal court system because it's not just. And I called the system then, and I call the system now racist, because that's what it is, just like Professor Stone talked about. And all of us in the system, public defenders, defense attorneys, judges, prosecutors, police, we all are part of that system, and we all have to take the blame, right? We all have to acknowledge, that's the most important thing, acknowledge what's wrong with our system. And the three things that I know when I became public defender, I have to look at it through the lens of the clients. I always have to think about the clients. If I was in their shoes, what would I want to change? How would I want to be treated by police? How would I want to be treated in court at trial? What would I want the judge to listen to at a sentencing if I got convicted? Guilty, accountable, have to be held accountable. So these are the things we look to. So my three things I'll talk about that I think have been very important that will change the narrative that we've been trying to do since I became the public defender, but also bring reform, are those intercepts: arrest, at trial and sentencing, right? And also bond court. So at arrest, obviously, you already talked about it, I have a police station unit, and I fought hard for Chief Judge Evans to allow me to get into the police stations, because I've known, doing this work for 33 years, that that's where racism exists through law enforcement, that's where we see injustices, that's where we see my clients treated inhumanely and with disrespect for no reason. Whether you're arrested on Guilty or innocent, you should be treated with respect. And that's why there is no trust in the community. So at arrest, if lawyers are at the police stations, not only do we hold police accountable, right? We make people understand what their rights are. We are there to stop the abuses and to be the check and balance, but also to make sure that people understand what's going on. They've been arrested, they're scared. And nowhere have we seen this than that weekend when 300 protesters were arrested. And almost 95% of them were released uncharged. And they all had a horrible, traumatic experience at that arrest at that police station. They were not allowed phone calls to talk to their family. They were not given a lawyer when they asked for a lawyer. They were called horrible things by the law enforcement of the Chicago Police Department. So that starts the system out bad. And then the bond reform is so important. Just like Sharone said, we've been working for years on this, but when you look and change the narrative and think people are arrested, they are presumed innocent. That's the narrative. You're presumed innocent until you're convicted in a court of law by a jury or a judge. So if you're presumed innocent, you should be presumed to fight your case outside, out of the jail. And we've never looked at it that way. We've locked everybody up and let a few people be released for the last 50 years. When the laws are on the books, the laws are written that you don't lock everybody up. You only lock the few up who are dangerous. So we've been working really hard on bond reform to get that narrative changed, to get people thinking differently about communities that are arrested, Black and brown communities, because of the laws on the books that are racist. And the third thing is, of course, legislation. We have so many laws for so many years that have just persecuted people, the most vulnerable people in our communities. Not only because of the color of their skin, but because of where they come from, because of their poverty, because of their class, because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation. These are the people that we prosecute, right? And these are the people that we have persecuted for decades unfairly. So we have a lot of work to do in these areas. We are working on great legislation with Ali Abid and Sharone Mitchell and Jobi Cates, looking at not only parole, but treating people fairly once they get into prison. And I'll end with this. We talk about what Europe has done. We talk about after World War II, Europe went one way and the United States went another way. The United States went punitive and most of the rest of the world went rehabilitative. So why can't we do that now? Why can't we look at our system and say, we know punitive doesn't work. We know harsher laws. We know mandatory minimum sentences. We know truth in sentencing. We know punishing juveniles as adults doesn't work, right? We're not safer, are we? We haven't been safer in 30 years. We had 3,400 shootings in Chicago so far. These laws have been on the books for more than 20 years. So we need to be rehabilitative. And if you have to go to prison, because you have to be held accountable, that's your punishment. Go into prison. Not when you're in prison. You shouldn't be oppressed in prison. You shouldn't be demeaned in prison. You should be thought of as a human being who is going to come home, and you should be treated as if you have potential and you are a human being and you have a life when you come home. And if you think and change the narratives and get people to understand those narratives, we can have real reform in our city, in our county, and in our country.
Oh, thank you very much. And I think that the part that I think, Randolph, you mentioned racism. And I think when we think about the disproportionate impact of the system and we say it's not working, I think the issue is that we continue need to remind everybody this is not working for a huge segment of Black and Latino people and poor people, right? And we need to remind everybody that we need to care, right? Alexa, last but not least, if you can create your opening statement and tell us the projects that give you hope, the ones you're most passionate about.
Sure. Thanks so much, Nicole. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I work at the MacArthur Justice Center, which is a national litigation firm, but headquartered in Chicago. And I think one of our defining traits, what I'm most proud of, is how nimble we can be. So the projects I have are both long-standing projects that I have been dedicated to over the past 10 years, and those that really are responses to the moment that so many of the panelists have been talking about. That includes a lawsuit against Cook County Sheriff Dart last spring for his, frankly, heinous handling of the COVID-19 pandemic in the jail. as well as a suit we're working with the public defender on. We're really proud to represent the public defender on, arising from the city's ongoing denial of access to counsel and to telephones to people in Chicago Police Department stations, a very long-standing practice of incommunicado detention that has really reached new heights following the social uprisings after the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and COVID, because CPD has used both as cover for really long-standing violations. So we've been able to bring lawsuits about those issues and respond to what's going on the ground, because litigation, as much as I love it, because I'm a litigator, is certainly not a panacea. And it is dependent entirely on the work of those advocates, grassroots organizers, people most affected who are actually doing the work on the ground. The litigation in the jail, completely dependent on the amazing work of the Chicago Community Bond Fund, who has endless connections to people inside and out, who could tell us about what the conditions were like and were willing to raise their voices about those conditions to the court. Same with access to counsel. It's totally dependent on the work of lawyers and community activists who have themselves been held incommunicado, who are again willing to raise their voices. So we try to pivot with the moment and pivot to what the communities want to do and support them as best we can. As for long-standing projects, I won't go on ad nauseum because it's pretrial justice. The elimination of cash bond, we come at it from a fairly unique perspective. We're trying to challenge it in the courts as a violation of constitutional due process. Basically, why did the rich go home and the poor stay in prison? It has nothing to do about keeping us safe or managing flight risk. It's about money. And decades of constitutional law say you cannot throw people in jail because they are poor. So with the Cook County Public Defender and in other parts of the state, we're trying to challenge those really malicious practices at the litigation level, because the skills I bring to the table, but all of this is reliant on our community partners.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I want to turn, we had a lot of themes about bond court and bond court being a place where we can reform. One of the things that was most astounding to me was back in 2016, Illinois Supreme Court Justice Ann Burke took a trip into bond court, not wearing, the robe. She was dressed in plain clothes, doing her own court watching. And on that day, she saw a horrendous sight. It was a person that was brought in front of the court wearing nothing but a garbage bag. And I've asked in my own research and in my own writing, how many different stakeholders, from police to social workers to public defenders to prosecutors to the judge itself, saw the woman in the garbage bag, yet fell silent. And I'd like to have a few of you respond to that. How do we think about reform when the system itself has normalized a level of indignity that most of the public has not seen? So maybe if we can get, let me think here. Maybe Amy, if you can respond to that, because I'm sure your office might remember that case and might feel a certain way.
And just like I said before, Nicole, first you have to acknowledge the harm that you have been silent about, right? Whoever was in that courtroom at that time, someone needed to speak up. And obviously, if we represented that woman, I don't know if we did, but if a public defender was representing that woman, that public defender needed to speak up on behalf. That's what we do. We're advocates for clients, for human beings. And we are there to tell the story of our clients, to make sure that the judge and the prosecutor have all the information before they set bail in a case, right? The mitigating information. Why is this woman in a bag? What did she just come from the hospital? Is she homeless, right? Does she not have any clothes? Did they pick her up on the street? Is she using narcotics? Is she mentally ill? These are the things that as an advocate, when we do not advocate for our clients, we have to be held accountable. I'm trying to hold police accountable every day, right? With my police station unit. I have to hold my lawyers in my office accountable if they aren't doing the job they're doing as the leader of the office. And we do that, obviously, we try to do that with, the top down and bottom up in an office. I feel like in my office, I've tried to bring a different culture since I've been the public defender. I have said the word client-centered 1,000, if not 100,000 times. that everything you do as a public defender, you should be thinking about the client, not yourself, not your colleague, certainly not the judge, not the prosecutor, not in yourself, like meaning your reputation, right? You need to be thinking about that client. And what would that client want from a public defender? Would that client want that public defender to stay silent and do nothing and sit by while that woman was demeaned and demoralized in a courtroom full of people? No. That client deserved an advocate in that case. So every day I say it, I instill it in every memo. I talk about it at every leadership meeting. And finally, I really think bringing this holistic type defense to my clients, it's working. My lawyers are thinking outside the box. They're not thinking about just the charge. They're not thinking about their clients as only the charge, right? They're human beings. They have families. They have issues that they bring to the table that must be dealt with. Whether they're poor or they need a job or they need to get in school or they're a youth who is going through some trauma issues because of where they're living, or they hear gunshots every day when they wake up, or they haven't had breakfast because they're poor. These are issues that my lawyers need to be on top of. And that's why in my office, I'm hiring social workers and I'm hiring mental health people to deal with these issues, to help the lawyers give a more holistic defense in a case.
Thank you. And I want to make sure too, I think what's interesting about that case was so many different institutional actors had to see her wearing a garbage bag, right? And in some ways normalize a level of indignity in that. And so, Jobi, I think you really brought it to the forefront and really kind of set a priority to say, how is justice being reformed unless it's experienced a particular way by those most impacted, be it the defendant or the victim or a witness or the general public that might have walked into the courtroom that first day and that was their only experience seeing our court system. So from your perspective, what is it that we could do to shift, not just reform the bond court, which is important, and we'll get to it, but that cultural lens, if you will?
Yeah, I think, I am on the edge of my seat when we talk about the humanity of the situation. And when I said I didn't know anything when I came into this work, I didn't know anything about how bad it was. And I went to visit a young man in prison whose mom I had met the same day I met Randy at Northwestern in 2008. And when I went to Menard Correctional Center in Southern Illinois, forgive my voice, I'm recovering from a not COVID, I guess. I went down to Menard. It's about 5.5, 6 hours away. And here's a really good example of how disconnected these types of conversations are from reality of people who are incarcerated. At the time, Menard had almost 4,000 men in it. And most of them were Black and from Cook County. So I drive 6 hours down south of St. Louis, and I've parked my car in the designated visitor parking lot, which is as far away from the entrance to the prison as you can possibly get. And you're forced then to walk across the staff parking lot to get there. Mm-hmm. And I get so upset and angry when I remember this memory, it still haunts me. The cars with Confederate flag stickers, the trucks with political stickers that you wouldn't see in Cook County very often anyway. Right. The entire staff at Menard is white. Mm-hmm. And almost the entire population at Menard is Black. And that prison supports that community and keeps it alive. Mm-hmm. It is one of the most stark, I think, examples in Illinois of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in this country. It's more apparent in other parts of the country. It's more on the surface in Illinois, especially if you live in Chicago I live in Evanston. I live in my little bubble. I can pretend. When it comes to changing policy, I think those of us on this call are experts at changing a law, changing a policy, persuading an administrator to change a practice. But Randy was really getting to it, and so was Amy in their comments earlier. Our culture has not caught up with us yet. Mm-hmm. And there are behaviors and practices that we cannot legislate in this system, like seeing a human being in front of you instead of a dirtbag or a thug. And that, I don't believe we can legislate it. I believe we have to relate our way through this. And I'll just stop by saying, Brian Stevenson had it right and continues to always, of course, have it right. he should have been our next Supreme Court justice, god damn it, when he said, you have to get proximate.
Yeah.
I have learned everything that matters by getting closer to people in prison and their families, and getting closer to the lawyers who defend people who love them. And they love them. Amy, your people love their clients. They don't just defend them. I've seen Chris Anderson, and holy cow, your people fight for the human beings in their care. That is not true throughout the system. And until we can figure out a way to marry all this great policy idea, policy energy with the reality that Illinois has 118 legislative districts, and don't think about the Democrat or Republican. We have, 118 House districts. You can't get more than 35 votes on a really, truly difficult criminal justice reform bill in the House right now. Any proposal that actually changes something significant, you've got a long haul. You've got to find those 40 votes or so, and you got to find them outside of Cook County, which means you got to find them with white people, Republicans, rural people, and people who are parking their cars in parking lots like the one in Chester, Illinois.
And it's good. I think if you're from Chicago, as I am, we don't do enough due diligence to think about what's happening downstate, right? Some of us think like south is, you drive south past, Comiskey, and the next thing you know, you fall off the face of Illinois or something. But I think it's important to realize that what's happening in Cook County is then sustaining communities in the southern parts of the state. But then the other side of it is the decisions that are happening in Cook County are creating that population as well, right? So it's it's definitely important. I want to continue with the bond court reform. There was lots of coverage in the news about how judges were dismissing basic things like risk assessment. I always joke that I'm not one. Risk assessment can have its own set of biases, but in the absence of any tool to decide who is supposedly dangerous or an increased risk of flight or an increased risk of criminal activity while on pretrial release, a basic risk assessment tool can be better than a judge's discretion to just throw everyone in jail. Can we talk a little bit about the judge's resistance to the reforms? Because I think that's a key issue here. If, we have a chief presiding judge, but if the judges run their individual court call like a mini fiefdom, how do we get anything reformed? So I know, Jonathan, you were more sunshiny. I can give you a chance to be a little bit more gloom and doom, unless you have a good spin on that.
I don't. I mean, and this is going to be something, because I've now seen judges from misdemeanor all the way up to appellate and like beyond that now. So I've seen a gamut of judges, and one of the biggest obstacles in bond reform is sitting behind the bench, and that is just, you could take the phrase bond reform out of that sentence and it would probably still be true in so many aspects, right? Pushing anything new to a judge is terrifying to them, and many of them are ingrained and want to keep the system that what they knew, that's the only thing they know, and there is such there's such an inflexibility that comes from the bench sometimes. It's not across the board, of course. There are some judges and there are some reform-minded judges, but when you sort of step back and think about it, so many of the folks who became judges were the byproduct and birthed in a system that we now look back and say that was really screwed up. We're talking about the 90s and that era. Those prosecutors.
Well, and to be clear, they were also, many of them were former prosecutors.
Yeah, I was going to say
the majority of the judges they have gone through a system, a type of cultural indoctrination that allowed them to rise through the ranks of being a particular type of prosecutor that then allowed them to run for judge. So I just want to be very clear, right, about what, for people listening and not think, people think that if you're elected to judge, you come in as this impartial figure, but there is a robust history to that.
No,
right?
I mean, I think if people, and Justice Watch has done a brilliant job of looking at this in Cook County, but if you look at judges throughout the state, the state's attorney is extremely well represented. And that's going to be hostile to these kinds of reforms, because most state's attorneys are not open to those kind of reforms. And so trying to get past that, you're already fighting the headwinds, and the judicial headwinds kind of come even harder at you which really does highlight the fact that, like, you know, as a litigator, I want to hit everything with the litigator hammer, but you know, judges are there blocking a lot of our reform efforts, and that's why it's like, to go back a little sunshiny, like you have to pull in all these outside efforts so that the legislature comes out and says, no, judges, you can't do this. You keep trying this. We're finally going to step up and say no. And then maybe you'll get some glacial movement, but we really do have to sort of reform like where we get our talent from as well from the bench.
And, you know, I think too, and this, you know, maybe anyone can chime in on this because it could be a public defender question, but it also could be some, you know, working on bond court reform. I was there back in bond court reform, back in bond court to research the waiting room, the second book that I worked on, which focused more on the jail. And what I saw is social workers or maybe public defenders asking whether defendants had family in the court. And then they were kind of doing this sly thing like, do you have any money on you? Do you have any? So in the hopes that if they could make an appeal to the judge that they had family, that there's somebody there to vouch. And to me, it felt like the punitive nature of the system was bleeding into the families, people who had not been charged with crimes. A family, you know, my maiden name is Gonzalez. The Gonzalez family stood up. You know, it was a sister, a girlfriend, and a mother, all there advocating for their son and partner. And I just thought, wow, you cannot shake these people for more money. They're already stretched as thin as possible. So tell me a little bit about these kind of informal ways that bond court is really draining people. And how do we get that to stop? Because that, to me, even if you in cash money bail to some extent or reduce it, what seems a reasonable bail is still not reasonable to the poorest of the poor.
Well, I'll take that from a legal perspective. There shouldn't be any money bail. Like, that just shouldn't exist. If the judge wants to hold somebody pre-trial, then they have to have a hearing, and the state has to meet their burden of proof that the person is dangerous. And that's a hard burden. It's a clear and convincing evidence burden in this, you know, legal speak. Right now, they just use cash bond as the lazy way out to keep people in. And they do it for political reasons because, you know, elected judges. There's a lot of pushback from the mayor, from the police chief every time they let people out. And what's the pushback if they don't? I mean, in St. Clair County, where we're looking at, it's East St. Louis, Illinois, they don't even record bond hearings. There's no transcript. It's completely in the dark. There's no transparency. So the only transparency that exists is if the judge lets somebody out and then they maybe commit another crime. And if that's the way the analysis goes, then there's no impetus for reform. So the way to change the system is hold the parties to their burden, and then also to bring light to the issue. And from my point of view, I think it needs to get up to the Illinois Supreme Court. You mentioned Justice Burke. I mean, she needs to do the right thing. She needs to have a case. That court needs to say no more cash bond. Cash bond should be verboten. And if that is done, I think it's one really important step forward in reform.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, Ali, do you have a more comment?
Yeah, and just to sort of build off of that, you know, I would say that in addition to sort of all of the issues present with money bond and the fact that like that is inherently and inescapably, you know, in a situation that is divorced from the underlying goals of like assessing flight risk and public safety risk, that it is inherently something that is euphemistically used and used in a way to cover up a lot of stuff. Like, we have to get rid of money bond. That is a walkout. And really for people who can understand that is how money bond is used, the debate is usually just about how swiftly we end money bond and not about whether we need to. We need to end money bond. It has to end. But I think one of the other things to note is the other ways that, even without engaging in money bond, the other ways, you know, to your question, Nicole, like how bond court drains families, and particularly women of color who are related to the men of color who are disproportionately arrested and dragged into the court. You know, we have money bond as one source, and now we have, to an increasing extent, the use of electronic monitoring. And the sort of expansion of electronic monitoring that we need to, and we are currently and will continue to be looking very closely at in Cook County, and I think elsewhere throughout the country, about how extensively it is used, how onerous the conditions are, and how much, how much it is a fair process in the sense of the interminable nature of sometimes people are put on electronic monitoring, and typically up until recent reviews and until recent our scrutiny on this, not really brought up for review that often. Like, should they continue to be on electronic monitoring? They've been doing very well. Like, is this a level of control that we need to keep on them and their families? The fact that not everyone who has housing has the type of housing that is all right for electronic monitoring, and so arrangements have to be made, or they have to just sit in the jail, even though they've been given a form of release. So all these other ways that we're draining individuals, and we're sort of throwing machinery and monitoring at the problem, rather than, again, going back to what we should be looking for: is this person actually a risk?
And I think
you're convincing evidence. So,
I think it's a good point about, from my research, talking to people that have been on electronic monitoring, we think of that as a less punitive alternative. We think, well, rather than being in the Cook County Jail, the population, the numbers look good. And so, and then we're seeing the numbers rising in electronic monitoring. You have to imagine, though, there are people that express that they're literally tethered to the house. They can't go downstairs to drop their kids off to a bus, for instance, in pre-COVID days. They can't leave and get far enough to throw out their garbage. There was claims that sheriffs in some ways are retaliatory in where they put the box, so that, it would tether you to an inconvenient part of your home. Right. These are the informal ways that then you're punishing families, right? So that the sheriffs are now allowed into people's homes. Think about the intimidating nature of having your loved one tethered to that thing at 2 a.m. and the children are watching. And so I think about, Randolph, you've been, defending people, training lawyers, looking at the system for so many years. You brought up the topic about racism, which I think is a central piece of this. Talk a little bit about how can we reduce the punishment to families. This is all, we talk about collateral consequences, but you're not just punishing one defendant. One defendant is now related to so many other people. And how do we think about that as we think about reform?
Yeah, well, I wanted to respond a little bit to this judiciary issue, and
please,
how do we create a judiciary that is responsive to a lot of these questions, as opposed to maintaining the status quo. And I think somebody mentioned, I think it was Amy, who talked about making the public defenders more client-centered. And we need to do the same thing unfortunately, with our judiciary. We need to make judges more concerned about the people that come before them, as opposed to the assembly line moving of cases and processing cases and looking at their stats. And I think one of the ways to do it is the same way we tried to do it in the PD's office, top down and bottom up, right? We need to make sure that the judges that we select who come into the system are more appropriately centered. And how do we do that? I think we need to think about what are the requirements to be a judge in Illinois, in Cook County, and how can we change and modify those requirements to produce a better entering class of judges. Obviously, we need to think about the judges who run the system, right? The chief judge and all the little presiding judges of the criminal division, of the juvenile justice division, and make sure that those judges are appropriate, make sure that they're compassionate, make sure that they are race sensitive to questions of race, that they see race. And I think we can, it looks like a sort of a task that can't be accomplished, But I always think back to the death penalty and how in Illinois we abolished the death penalty in 2011, a major accomplishment. And it took a lot of folks from a lot of different areas working on it, but we got it done. And unfortunately, when we got it done, we kind of sat back and relaxed and took a deep breath and said, oh, wow, what a miracle. Instead of continuing that collaboration of those groups into other areas that we could improve upon our criminal justice system. So we look around the country now and we've got this sort of movement about progressive prosecutors, which is a good thing, a great thing. I think we need to do the same thing with judges. We need to look at some other systems and figure out, are there areas in the country where the judges, the quality of judging is better than it is in Cook County, and how can we replicate it, or how can we improve it? Because I think there are other areas in the country where, judging is considered a little bit more progressive than it is here in Cook County.
Now, I will say this. Thank you for mentioning the judges and how we can think about that. I love this idea of reform-oriented judges. My frustration as a non-lawyer, but as a researcher, is that it's so hard to get good information to voters about judges. That was the first issue. And I was frustrated at the bars, the local bars' reluctance to give a negative review to a judge. Even law schools around the area, many of them have contacted me with a lot of vigor wanting to do court watching. And then they realize that they're going to court watch their alumni. And they're like, wait a second, we don't want to give a negative review to this judge. He graduated from, and then insert, any of the local law schools that are part of the community that really becomes a pipeline to being a criminal justice attorney. So how do we break that so that the in some ways the professional organizations, the bar associations, become part of that change that you're describing, Randolph, and anybody can chime in for that.
So,
yeah, Sharone, please.
No, this is on the topic of doom and gloom. I'm not sure that you're going to find salvation in the bar associations. I think that there have been a lot of great reforms in Cook County. Most of them have had to do with, we have an incredible roster of leaders. You have Amy Campanelli, a person who's not scared of anybody, who will say whatever she feels. You got Kim Fox, who is trying to change the state's attorney's office. You have Tony Preckwinkle, who's the first politician I've ever known to say the criminal justice system is racist, and a bunch of other people. Like, you got a great roster, the best roster I think we've ever had in Cook County. With that said, I will say this. One of the biggest reforms have been that we are taking judges seriously. We're taking races seriously. There are folks who are on the bench who have always operated in the sense that if I let this person out, this person will do something bad and I'll be in the news. So I must be punitive. And now we're starting to turn that over, where you have people being voted out because now they're too punitive.
Right.
And you start to see judges kind of reacting to that. So you have to give a shout out to the Judicial Accountability PAC, right? Yeah. For those who don't know that, we need to understand that group and groups like it have made it possible for us to take these judicial races seriously. And we have a conversation going on now, and I don't want to say which way you should go, but we should know that there are policy-based reasons to talk about removing the judge. And that has been one of the biggest reforms that we have seen, and we need to continue to move that, and we need to continue to look at the Injustice Watch and continue to look at JPAC and continue their leadership of really thinking about, it's not just about how many bench trials or jury trials or how long you've been in the system, is how you've lived your life as a lawyer and a litigant, and do your ideals match up with the ideals that I have when I'm talking about the criminal justice system. And I really, really, really love and support those folks that have started to have that conversation, because we haven't had it in Cook County for a very long time. And obviously Chicago Appleseed has done a really great job in terms
And
of
the Council of Lawyers as well, doing
and
their
the Council of
reviews.
Lawyers.
Yep.
Exactly.
And I will say, you're right. You're right. I mean, I think the idea that the bar is supposed to change things. However, when you leave law school, there is a sense of ethics that has been imposed, right? You take a sworn commitment. And so I think, I know that one thing that Appleseed has done is try to engage lawyers across the spectrum, whether you're working in corporate law firms, that this criminal justice reform is for everybody, right? And Jobi, I think you had another comment on there too, that we were in this,
Yeah,
talk a little bit
just
about
wanted
elections.
to add,
Yeah,
because I think a lot of people in the audience for this are lawyers. Is that right?
yes.
All right, lawyers, come here for a second. Let's talk. So we just did we just did our first ever candidate survey of races for prosecutor around the state, 102 offices. And one of the most disgusting, difficult, awful realities of this race that I found is that the vast, vast majority, there's only one candidate. Yeah. So who gives a crap what they say on their questionnaire? You don't have a choice. There's only one candidate. And there are only 2, maybe 3 races that are real races.
Right.
In 102 counties. So come back, come here. You ever thought about living in, I don't know, Randolph County, maybe running for prosecutor, nice country house? You can make a life there. You can make a real difference. This won't happen without human beings doing it. They're not, those people aren't there. They're not magically springing out of the ground. We have to push. So consider yourselves pushed.
I love that. I love the call to action. I'm sorry, Amy, do you have a comment?
I just wanted to jump on what Jobi said. We have gotten about 15 public defenders on the bench in the last, 4 years, which is great, right? It's unbelievable because just like you said, Nicole, the majority have been prosecutors for decades. And so we're bringing somewhat of a balance, and we've gotten women and women of color and men of color on the bench. So it's become more diverse, which is, we just need to keep striving for that and doing what Sharone said, looking at these groups and what they're talking about with judges and supporting those groups in the work they do. And if you've been watching around the country, right, you've seen public defenders running for prosecutor, right? And winning. And if not winning, almost winning. So we've got to keep supporting the country, the global work that's been happening in the systems, not just ours, but supporting everything that's happening around the nation and looking at what's happening, that, oh my God, we're going to support these people who, just because you are a public defender doesn't mean you shouldn't be the next state's attorney of that city, right? Or that county, because you now have a different view, because you've represented these people and you can bring a different viewpoint and make a state's attorney's office much more accountable to the clients that they want to convict and put in prison.
Exactly. Thank you. I want to change to, is there one more, Jonathan, just to.
I just wanted, I'll be real quick. I want to plug off of what Sharone said, talking about like understanding and taking these judicial races seriously. One of the big things that Appleseed has always been doing and is really pushing is to actually try to get some light into the court system itself. The Illinois court system isn't subject to FOIA. So if you want to go and try to get any information about it, you basically have to convince them to give it to you willingly. And guess who wants to give that stuff over willingly? Right. Injustice Watch just released their big survey of the whole thing. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. But part of this reform that Appleseed is pushing is FOIA reform. And if the more information people get about their judges, the more they realize they need to take this stuff seriously. And that's it.
Absolutely. I want to move to the jail. And Tom Dart has positioned himself within the media as a reformer. And it is really tough because the rank and file sheriffs that are at the managing the Cook County Jail, floating in and out of the court systems, tend to be particularly cruel, both in my research for Cook County, but also when revisiting for the waiting room. People were being released in the winter with no coats, and then they would say, but here's the poor box, giving them a coat only to tell them that those coats had bed bugs in them. And so you see people fleeing and running away from the jail like it's chasing them. People left sleeping on a garbage can on cold nights in Chicago. Alexa, I know you did the lawsuit, right? That really pushed Tom Dart to kind of face up to how the conditions were for COVID. I think as I think regular citizens don't realize the conditions of that jail, and we keep saying it's improving, but that's because I think our standards are so terribly low. So where do we go from here? How do you hold, I think we've talked a little bit about top down, bottom up. How do you hold Sheriff Dart accountable through litigation? But then what can we all do to hold the sheriffs, the rank and file sheriffs that create such abuse?
I know Amy probably has a lot of thoughts on this too. So the COVID litigation was successful in some ways. I mean, we had a hearing in front of a federal judge who ordered that the sheriff institute specific sanitation measures, because the jail was a disgusting pit, provide face masks, do testing, do specific quarantining, and implement social distancing in the group housing because people were sleeping on top of each other in an air pandemic. But then the appeals court found that those measures were really too intrusive and went overboard in terms of taking away the Dart's authority. So upheld most of them, but took away the social distancing requirements, which honestly were probably the core of the relief. And the federal judge also denied our request for release. And I think that really, that whole litigation, I'm proud of it. I'm proud of the work we did and the community groups did. It was really unbelievable. But it also shows the limits of the law. And ultimately, what I've come to see is to protect people, you need to get them out. And I've always thought that, but I've really doubled down on that belief now. And that's why we're trying to focus more on bond reform, because I think, the vast majority of people in the jail are there pretrial. And so if we can get people out on pretrial release in the years before they go to trial, then I think that's how we protect them. Because there have been scores of damages lawsuits against those deputies that you discussed, Nicole, and Sheriff Dart has been sued innumerable times, but it hasn't stopped his PR machine. It hasn't stopped the violations. And if COVID can't, I don't know what else can. So I think the work we're doing on the ground and all these advocates are doing on the ground to get people out, that has really reinforced my belief that that's the way forward.
Right. And I think that that's important. I mean, for the former public defenders, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is you're in the trenches of this, right? You're advocating for your client, but you're also seeing the most egregious abuses, right? That your clients are telling you, I'm being deprived medicine. This has happened to me. I was beaten. How do you, as public defenders, though, in some ways, collect those stories to gain advocacy? I mean, this to me is the hardest part. Many public defenders in my research talked about retaliation. They were absolutely scared to oppose prosecutors, line prosecutors, judges. They didn't want to be seen as being too cushy with their clients, but yet the public defenders are the front line of seeing this abuse, and these collective stories create patterns that show it's systemic, right? It's not just one part of the jail, it's all parts of the jail. How can we think about that as a team of public defenders then working on the larger problems, not just the individual client?
So I'll just speak as brief as I can. So, the George Floyd movement and what happened during the protest and the marches, and when we marched around Cook County Jail, we marched around, the correctional officers knew we were there, clients were putting up signs in the windows, thank you for caring about us, thank you for caring about us live. Now I have lost 6 clients to COVID in Cook County Jail. 7 inmates have died from COVID. 6 of those were represented by public defenders. And after we marched around the jail in the summer, 7 Cook County correctional officers wrote horrible, racist, disgusting things on Facebook. And we got wind of it. And I immediately, the minute I found out about it, I made a complaint to the Inspector General. And all 7 of those were severely disciplined through the Sheriff's Office. And that started a conversation, right? And we've had many conversations with specifically the Black lawyers in my office. We have regular meetings and we talk about the discrimination against the Black public defenders from Cook County correctional officers and prosecutors, like you said, Nicole, and judges. And we have this lifeline of complaints now that we are taking, and we've made complaints. Whether it's to Kim Fox's office because her prosecutor has been treating my Black public defender differently than my white public defender, or it's a correctional officer who makes a racist remark to one of our clients, or a judge who quite frankly made a racist remark reasonably to a juvenile client. So we are on top of these things. We're trying to make sure we call these people out, hold them accountable, and give my staff the courage to know that I will back them. I will be there for them. I'm not afraid to file a judicial inquiry brief. I think I've filed at least 5 since I've been public defender against 5 different judges who made horrible racist remarks up in Rolling Meadows against, Latino clients. And other, one judge made a remark about slavery and just these things that you see people's real character, right? So there are ways that we can hold people accountable when they make these horrible statements or they are extremely racist. It goes back to the racism, right? I just want to say law enforcement, correctional officers, right? That's where it starts. And then it does seep into.
Yeah, I think we lost the last part, but.
Just saying it seeps into the courthouse,
It does seep into the courthouse.
If you allow a police officer to say something and make an unlawful arrest that is racially biased, or unlawful stop and frisk, or a search warrant, and he brutalizes the family after he goes into the house, and then a judge says that's okay in court, you lose that pretrial motion. Now the judge has perpetuated that racist behavior, and that officer will never go back and change their behavior because they've just gotten away with it. And that's how it's been for decades, right? So we need to not only call out individual officers, we need to bring it to the Chicago police, we need to call out our prosecutors and our judges who misbehave and act completely inappropriate in their position.
Absolutely. We are getting a ton of questions. We have about 15 more minutes left of the panel. So we're going to start doing lightning round questions and moving it along to make sure we get a few of the questions from the audience as well. I'm going to use someone named Jane's question that she wants to know about police changes. And I think for me, the system has a way of snapping back, meaning we abolished the death penalty, and yet we see what happened to Laquan McDonald. We see what happened to so many other young Black and Latino people. And I think for all the people that survive, right? So we think of the most egregious cases as people like Laquan McDonald who were shot and killed, but the trauma of being beaten, the trauma of arrest that is meant to terrify you and rough you up and injure you. We have had the Department of Justice come into the city of Chicago and look at the police department. They recommended almost 100 reforms. And I think the count is about 25 of them have been done. Most of them ineffectual nonsense that don't change the face of policing. How have the police resisted reform so well? And what could we do to press back on their resistance? And I don't know who should start on this one, but go for it. Ali, do you want to do it? You want to try it?
Sure, I'll just start us off. I mean, in terms of like the CPD's resistance to reform, it's been fairly exemplary in terms of like how much they've been able to resist all these big moments of uprisings of voice to push back against them. Right now we're kind of at a nadir of hope right now because the big working groups that were put together to gather community voice have all been rejected. The budget is defiantly against any actions to defund the police. And from recent sort of public discussions with all the alderpersons, it seems like neither of the two major reform packages for oversight, either GAPA or CPAC, seems to be very likely to move forward, given the current mayoral administration's posture against them. So, and so with that, I would say what lines of attack we have, and probably the still most potent ones, is to see if legislation at a state level or such can chip away at what can be allowed in the collective bargaining agreements and contracts of the CPD and others that prevent some of the most major transparency that we could have. The ways in which complaints against officers are given over to the complaining officer, the names, the way that misconduct records are destroyed after a few years, the way that a number of the ways that the worst officers can remain protected and anonymous and protected by the impunity of all this, and prevents is all tied up in what is possible to be done in the collective bargaining agreements. And I do believe that some of that could be chipped away by at least state level legislation. So,
And I think that's, I think that that's an important point too, how we deal with complaints. I know that the Invisible Institute, led by Jamie Calvin, has done an enormous effort in suing to get the data of police misconduct available to the public. You can literally query the officer's name and see how many infractions they have. And I think what's astounding is the leadership. The president of the police union is one of the worst among them. And meaning he has more infractions than most officers on the force. And that means that a significant amount of police officers voted for that type of officer. Now, my question would be, between the prosecutors and the public defenders, how are these types of officers still welcome in the court? Welcome to testify, welcome to gather evidence when they are brutalizing people and they have these histories of everything from assault to other types of abuses. Is there something that prosecutors and public defenders and judges alike can align upon? We've seen do not call lists, but this would be more expansive, taking this data about the worst offenders and saying, you are so ineffectual, we will not welcome you into these courts. We are pushing and against that type of evidence and that type of officer.
I don't know if this answer fits, but I think it may fit for both the first and second question. It is not yet politically advantageous to take a serious stance against police violence and police ineffectiveness.
Yeah.
So when you look at our alder people, right, there are only a few alder people that feel like they have the leave to say what needs to be said out loud that get said in these conversations among advocates and friends like us. So we still live in a world in which we believe the only true path to safety is more police, and that anything that happens outside of that is just a bad apple doing the wrong thing, but we still need more police. Until we crack that nut, until elected officials are able to empowered to take a stand that is aggressive against ineffective policing, these issues will continue to happen, and it'll be very difficult for us to put in real significant structural change on this issue.
Well, I guess then the question, if it's not politically advantageous, and I don't know who wanted to take this question, but the city's 2020 budget set aside $153 million for legal settlements. They are literally predicting that the police are going to abuse people, harm people, and have to settle cases to that extent. I mean, to me, that level of money, if we could think about it, pushed into different, everything. We always say we don't have money for rehabilitative programs. We don't have money for the public defender's office. People talk about everything from infestations in the offices because we don't have enough money. But to me, we are paying for that. So is there a way to create a momentum so that $153 million looks unacceptable, and in some ways shift the responsibility to the unions or to the police themselves to pay for that level of error?
Can I say one, Nicole? There's a consent decree over the Chicago Police Department, and part of that consent decree involves working groups with community members on various issues. And I think one way to chip away at that is to remove police through the working group process from areas where they traditionally had a stronghold. For instance, schools, working group on schools, police in schools right now. And that's an issue that is seeing a lot of headway. There's been a lot of movement as a community. A year ago, nobody wanted to take police out of schools. Now it's actually we're making strides. And I think if that working group recommends police get moved out of schools, which is very possible, that would be a huge head change. And I also think it would support the fact that there would be many, many fewer violations in schools. There's so many instances of lawsuits arising from police battering and abusing kids. So that's one thing, is to just take them away from the areas where they are actually causing the most harm. And sometimes that's really an inside-outside advocacy campaign beyond, cities. It's like the communities, it's the local school councils working to get rid of the police.
Right.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. On the other hand, I mean, there was just this working group on use of force. And, from what I understand, they made like 100 recommendations to the mayor. And this was a group that the mayor appointed.
Right.
And the police simply ignored 95% of the recommendations that the working group made. Very disappointing. And, I worked with the mayor on the Police Accountability Task Force. So, she knows better. I mean, she's not someone who doesn't know what's going on. But it's just so disappointing to see her drag her feet on the consent decree, ignore the recommendations of many of the working groups. And I think we're just going to have to make her pay at the next election. And we're going to have to support aldermen who are cognizant and aware about these issues and try to punish those who are, opposed.
And thank you, Randolph. I think Jobi also on that same line of thought about the politics of all this. Jobi, can you jump in about that?
I mean, I think I love this conversation because I love this group of people so much. Can we just do this every Friday? Let's do it. It'd make for a really good send off to the weekend. But we have to play a long game and a short game, right? So we talk about the short game. What can we do in the next year, in the next 2 years, working group? The long game, when you mentioned local school councils, Alexa, that's part of the long game too, that we aren't existing in a vacuum from the national mood. And the national mood right now is you're on this side or you're out. And I don't listen to anything your side says. So when we say defund police or reallocate resources, they hear snowflake anarchist, which I love. It's such an oxymoron. And the conversation's over. It doesn't even start. And one of the things I think is part of this national mood that's seeped into everything, and I've noticed it even in the criminal legal reform work we do, have been doing over the years, the acrimony has just gotten worse and worse and worse. And the sides are getting more, the litmus tests for whether you belong to a side are getting more strict. So our long game is to change the math. We have to change the math in some of these districts. We have to start having conversations with people who don't agree with us. And we have to start doing it regularly. And we have to start listening. I don't want to say we have to listen to bigotry, because we don't. But we do have to hear when people say, for example, in some of the communities in Chicago that are minority Black communities have voted, the LSUs have voted to keep their school resource officers. They don't feel safe. I have 2 men working for me who collectively did 50 years in the Department of Corrections, who both, their first reaction to taking resource counselors out was, I wouldn't send my kids there then. Those places aren't safe. That's the knee-jerk reaction. And these are people who agree with us on everything else. We have a long game to play. We have a lot of conversations to have with people outside this world who we're thinking so hard about our short game and the policy victories we want to have that sometimes we don't take the time to have the uncomfortable conversation with somebody who isn't in our circle.
Yes, exactly. We're running towards the end of the session, and we have a great question from Brendan from Schiller Law. And he wants to know from some of you, what is the most radical system altering change that can realistically be accomplished in the next 6 months? And what is the path to accomplishing that change? Oh, man. You know what? I'm going to say, well, it was not me.
Why don't we just ask Brendan?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. But I think it's a fair question. I mean, we talked, Jonathan, you were, started the panel off very, a little bit more optimistic. I know there's so many, we've talked a lot about the hurdles, but if we can maybe leave on a note that says this is attainable, what are some of the things quickly that are attainable given the climate that we can really work towards? And especially, I know a lot of Chicago Appleseed, it's a great way to end because of all the advocacy work they've been doing.
I sincerely hope that, and I'll be really quick, it's absolutely achievable, and it would make a huge difference in ways that I think people don't even comprehend. But if you abolish money bail and don't replace it with a system that incarcerates people, you're going to see drastic improvements, and that's absolutely within reach. It's on the table, it's out there, the bill is solid. Let's get that done. You'll see the beginning of hopefully more seismic changes.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, I would like to say the one thing that I'd like to see accomplished is a focus on people reentry, people coming out of prison. So, we've got, 30, 40,000 people every year coming out of prison in Illinois, half of them coming back to Cook County. I would like to see an intensive focus on those folks in terms of providing them housing, educational opportunities, counseling, whatever they need to be functional in the society so that they don't wind up homeless, back in prison within 2 years.
Yeah. Ali?
I think that would make a tremendous difference.
Absolutely. Ali, do you have a final thought?
And honestly, I think my things have been said, ending money bail. And I think there is still a great chance for meaningful reform of police and civilian relations through veto session in Springfield, and that is what I would be hoping for.
Yeah. And Alexa?
I won't parrot. I think I'll just stand on the answers these brilliant people gave to one very tough question.
Yeah, I know, right? Amy, do you have a radical reform? I know you've mentioned a lot.
Yeah.
So
no, I would say that, just the one that I think might be able to happen, Brendan, is I think we're going to mobilize these mental health mobile units. We've been talking about them. We recommended them in the Police Accountability Task Force subcommittees. The federal consent decree talks about them. We have great organizations like CRED and READY and all these social service agencies who are ready to, when we have a mental health call or a substance abuse call, to go out with a paramedic and a mental health professional instead of the police, right? Instead of the police, we stop this excessive force because they're not trained. And then those people, if we need a police officer, if they get to the scene and they can't, de-escalate, then we call the police. And we don't have to call it defunding the police. Let's change the wording of it so community isn't scared that we're defunding. We're going
community
to
first responders, something like that.
First responders go, and people are supporting this. We've been talking about this for 5 years. I think we can get this off the ground because other states are doing it, and the outcomes are tremendous for the communities. I think we can do it.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody, and I want to thank everyone who tuned in. This has just been an honor to be here talking with all of you. I want to give the floor, the final remarks to Sharone Mitchell, who is going to tell us a little bit about Chicago Appleseed, and then we'll sign out after there.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing a great job. Listen, you had six people that got a lot of experience giving closing arguments. They wanted to get their stuff out, and you did an excellent job of wrangling us. So to you, 7 people, thank you for being a great moderator. On behalf of Chicago Appleseed, I want to thank the panelists, obviously the moderator. This has been a really great discussion. This forum is part of a month-long conversation, a spotlight event that we're having, which is taking place in lieu of our annual fundraising luncheon. Obviously, COVID has made things very difficult for organizations like Appleseed to do things the way they want to do it. So Chicago Appleseed and the Chicago Council of Lawyers are part of a collaboration for justice, which focuses on access to justice, which focuses on economic justice, criminal justice. We ask, hopefully, that if you like this conversation, you're inspired by some of the things that have been said today. You want to help support the work of folks like Malcolm, folks like Sarah. Congratulations on your marriage. We ask that you make a charitable contribution by going to the website, chicagoappleseed.org/donate, or go to collaborationforjustice.org. And if you want to get involved, I know we have a lot of lawyers out there. You don't have to be a criminal justice expert. You can just get involved with your work. You can go to our website, chicagoappleseed.org, and you can sign up for the monthly newsletter. You can find some great opportunities to get involved, or you can send an email to it may be flashed on the screen, but caffj@chicagoappleseed.org. Thank you so much to everybody watching. Thank you to our great panelists. Thank you to our amazing moderator, and hope everybody has a great weekend. Stay clean, stay safe. Talk to you guys soon.
Thank you, everybody.